Welcome everybody. This time I'm not David Farman. So welcome to the Z Boulder's Canyon Theater. This session is sponsored by MindSpark Learning. They're sponsoring all the sessions in this venue. This is session 2, the Beat Generation, with Anne Waldman and Andrew Schelling. I have some announcements to run through while people are filing in, and then we will get started with the session. So, both authors will be available after this session for book signings. That will be in the Canyon Gallery immediately behind us. So please feel free to join them there. Their books will be on sale as well. So please don't leave your bags unattended. Ensure your phones are switched off or on silent mode so we don't get those lovely little symphony sounds. If you do have to have an urgent conversation, we would just ask you to slip out one of the doors and have it outside, but silence is great so people can hear. No flash photography is permitted in the venue, so if you do want to take pictures, please make sure your flashes are turned off. We welcome tweets, those of you who do tweets. Our hashtag is JLF@Boulder. It's wonderful to have tweets going on all through the festival. Festival merchandise will be on sale over in the south side of the library near the registration desk. They have some wonderful Indian-themed merchandise. You can get your own scarves there. In case of an emergency, please be calm and just evacuate out the doors on the back side. We will need to keep the aisles clear for emergencies. If you have any issues or wish to report a problem or anything, just grab one of the folks wearing a JLF volunteer shirt and they will take care of that. We also have a feedback form online and we appreciate any feedback. For those of you who have traveled here, thank you for coming, and remember you are a little over a mile high. So altitude can lead to altitude sickness. Drink lots of water, stay hydrated. If you start to feel headachy, aspirin is helpful, but take care of yourselves in that way. And then, thank you. I just want to say we are grateful for the tremendous support of the Boulder Library Foundation, which makes this program and so many others possible. If you are interested in being part of the Library Foundation, you'll find a table outside the registration area where you can make donations or join our Library League. We also want to make you aware that this festival is free because of donations, so there is also the opportunity to donate to JLF at Colorado, which is the funding organization for this festival, near the registrations. One final quick thing, some of you might be interested in hiking. We do have a special hike and hang on Sunday at 8 o'clock. You can hike Boulder's Chautauqua's Lower Meadow Loop with polar and world explorers and adventurers John Houston and Odd Harold Hagen. So you can sign up for that online. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome everybody. This panel is, or this conversation is on the Beat Generation. And I'm going to just open by asking Anne a few questions, but I want everybody to observe all the books that are laid out at her feet. And one of the things that the Beat Generation did do was produce an awful lot of books, and most of them really quite terrific books. And Anne has been carrying books most of her life around. I really want to start by asking you how you got interested in so-called beats and what it looked like for you growing up close to Greenwich Village.
Well,
and, let me just say a couple things around that, which is in North America, this is really a large continent. It doesn't feel like it quite so much now, but in the late 40s, early 50s, when the beats were coming to prominence, the country did feel a great deal larger, and air travel was not very common, so moving across the country meant long drives or train rides or bus rides, and I think it's not at all artificial that there's really a legitimate way to think that there was an East Coast beat manifestation and a West Coast, and somehow the arrival of these two groups of people who were both seeking alternatives to the sort of depressing conservatism of 1950s America really created enormous excitement around the country. And you grew up just south of Houston in New York, right on the fringes of Greenwich Village, and maybe you want to talk about what it looked like and what got you into this and what triggered your interest in the Beats as a generation and various individuals as poets and novelists and thinkers and activists.
Well, I grew up on McDougal Street, right below Houston in Little Italy, and, oh good, hey, it's good for Little Italy, yes. And my parents were sort of bohemians and had been college dropouts. My mother had gone off to Greece and lived there a decade and was married to the son of a Greek poet, and there's a whole story there. And my father had been a slide piano player, swing piano player, and also they lived in Provincetown and here and there. They were basically from the East Coast, both from working class families, but they met at a Issa Noguchi party in the village. So, very good bona fides there, my parents. So they were readers, and my father was, we were probably the Evergreen Review. I remember reading that fairly early when that was coming out, specifically the poetry. But there was a lot of following of the current poetry and literature going on in that area. My father came back from World War II and went to college on the GI Bill. He went to NYU and then Columbia, and he was studying to be a teacher himself and studying literature, of course. So there was a lot of support, I think, for my early interests. And I used to see Gregory Corso, who lived on Bleecker Street. He had spent time in prison. His mother had abandoned the family, Italian background. Turned out later his mother actually had not stayed in Italy, and she was living somewhere in New Jersey and running a little sandwich shop. So interesting links, further discoveries there on these different, the rhizome, the intricate rhizome of all these different characters. So I used to see Gregory. There was, of course, a lot going on McDougal Street, the whole, a lot of jazz, of course, but then the cafe scenes, the folk revival in Washington Square Park. So my brother was very active in that. So it was a real village upbringing. And I started reading fairly, I think that even in school we were reading Ferlinghetti's Christ Climbed Down. Maybe you remember that poem. It was in some small anthologies. And then of course Howl wrote this, and that was a sort of radical hook, as it was for many younger artists and writers and thinkers. It just cracked things open. It sort of changed the frequency of a lot of the more formal study of literature. And by the time I was in college, I was studying, primarily work coming out of the British English tradition, more formal poetries, powerful stuff. But when I went to Bennington College, various people were not being taught, and the writers I was being introduced to were white male, my father's generation, many who had survived the war and also with trauma, and that included folks such as John Berryman and Howard Nemeroff. Let's see who. Robert Lowell, of course, great, wonderful poet, very important poet. But he has that famous line, "Tamed by Milltown, we lie on mother's bed." And my question was, Milltown, what is that? Was that the drug of my generation? That's just a joke. But somehow the attention was on this a certain kind of spiritual angst. And so I was gravitating to a more experimental form, I guess. And I was finding it in Whitman, of course, and then through this sense of lineage to Ginsberg. And it was Howl, which was very, and I had a little note on some of this, very again, like this, shattering of revelation, the incantory power of, how he was using mantra, sort of Vedic strategies as almost political devices. I was drawn to this resistant poetics and this idea that we're the unacknowledged legislators of race. And in growing up in Greenwich Village, there was also, jazz very prevalent. Travel, this sort of sense of traveling. One wanted to travel to the more fellaheen worlds. Fellaheen is a term that Kerouac uses, and those are the places below the borders, going to Mexico, going to Morocco, going to India. And so these were, rather than going back to old Europe right away. So that was interesting. And then, an interest in Buddhism, and Alan Watts was, I'm sure many of you here, I'm sure have experienced some of these same, cultural hits from the phenomenal world. So I think, I don't know if that's going anywhere, but Alan, then my father had met Alan in the 50s, so I knew about Allen Ginsberg. I met him in the early 60s myself, and traveled to Berkeley, made a pilgrimage to the West Coast to see some of the what are called the experimental wing of the New American Poets gather in Berkeley. And it had to do with reading, though, very much reading, and then being in a situation where people were available and they were reading. So when I was back in the city in the 60s, Alan was in Europe, in Asia, part of that time, but there was a lot going on in these various off-site kinds of places, and there were many other folk, not maybe as well known, but felt an affinity and an inspiration through this sort of beat, I don't know, call them just gestures into the air. So,
yeah, and I really came into poetry more on the West Coast. My grandfather had been in the Navy and retired to Oakland, so I spent a lot of time there. And there's something always about the Bay Area in Northern California that really drew me. And I lived in California really in the 70s and 80s before coming out here to Boulder. And I remember we had a sort of joke that would go around that at some point in the 1950s, 3 or 4 guys from Columbia University in New Jersey showed up in San Francisco. The newspapers called it a renaissance. And there's a little bit of truth of that because, there was some real a catalyst quality to Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, but at the same time, for them to have been involved in a renaissance, it meant that there was an awful lot of ground that was already laid there. And the neighborhood that was really identified most with the beats was North Beach, which I think was really importantly not only not Anglo, it was Italian and then Portuguese fishermen, but the Italians brought in a long tradition of anarchist politics and union organizing, and there were longshore unions. And it was right adjacent to Chinatown, where you could hear Cantonese spoken and get good, inexpensive Asian food and feel that you were much more connected to Asia across the waters than you were to a far distant Europe. You could go hear Chinese opera. You could, see ink and brush work examples there. So there was a kind of fertile ground right there in San Francisco, but I think also really importantly, this long tradition of alternatives to mainstream institutions. One that I think was quite important was KPFA, the original Pacifica radio station, which KGNU is sort of a descendant of here, which was founded in 1949 by a guy who'd been out in California. He'd gone to Stanford University named Lewis Hill, and he was a Quaker. And as a Quaker, when World War II broke out and Pearl Harbor was bombed, he became conscientious objector, and the government thought conscientious objectors should be punished, so they sent him to a labor camp out near Carson City, sort of on the border of California and Nevada, and he spent the war carrying boulders from one side of the road to another for no evident reason. And when he came out, he went back to Washington, D.C., because he was offered a position as head of the new American Civil Liberties Union. It didn't pay his bills, so he got a job with a radio station in Washington, D.C. And there's 3 stories of why he quit. The first is that he was asked to read a newspaper report that he knew was full of lies. Second was that he was asked to read an advertisement about liver-flavored cat food, and in the middle of it he thought, is this what radio is descended to? The flavors of cat food? And the third and more likely is that he had prepared a report on American internment of people of Japanese descent after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And, people were removed from their homes on the West Coast and taken to detention centers in California and Wyoming and Oregon and Colorado and Arkansas and North Dakota. And when Lewis Hill tried to read his report, it was squelched by the editors, and he had a kind of religious vision of the possibility of a radio that was not dominated by corporate interests, would be immune to government influence, and even immune to mass culture or popular opinion. So he headed out west and found a whole bed of anarchists and people with a history of organizing out there. And I think the other thing that was really important about World War II setting the scene was that, not just Quakers, but pacifists of any sort who felt a instinctive resistance to World War II became conscientious objectors. And so the US government had a terrific idea. Let's take all the artists and put them in the most miserable place in the world. Let's put them on the rainy Oregon coast in a camp for conscientious objectors. So they put all the artists together in a series of camps, the most famous being Walport. And of course the artists got their hands on printing presses and printmaking equipment and began to write poetry and produce magazines. And when the war ended, most of them drifted down to San Francisco to see what was going on, and that really became the ground that other people came into. Most, notably 3 young lads from Reed College, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, and Lou Welch, and quickly they made friends with Joanne Kiger, Lenore Kandel, Helen Adam, Robert Duncan, a whole lot of other poets, and there were artists, filmmakers, journalists, labor activists there in San Francisco. So in a way, the ground was really quite prepared already.
It was in a very different terrain than New York. I mean, my father had been involved with the Communist Party earlier on, but I wasn't aware of those kinds of possibilities within the city itself, except in a slightly different generation.
Yeah, that's what it attracted me in a sense to the West Coast, as I found that there was much less institutional control over whether it was literature, poetry, any of the arts, even journalism, religion, all of those seem to be thriving outside of the universities.
Well, Allen and Kerouac, of course, had such difficulty at Columbia. I mean, that was the place where it all began, really, and incredible difficulty just staying with the program.
Right, well, weren't they both kicked out, or at least Allen was kicked out of Columbia?
Went into a mental hospital, and both traveled. Kerouac became already. So,
so talk about some of the great works or the books or the poems that.
Yeah, I thought it'd be fun to read a few little bits.
Yeah, sure.
And to maybe, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the most well-known texts, but we could start by doing that. And also, just to say what drew you as well to some of this, as writers ourselves, to the the different possibilities that open. But I was going to say something about. And so the idea of also being in public space. So my early introductions with Allen had to do with his public presentation, this incantorial power, this way that he could. It was more than just a poetry reading. It was a real another kind of intervention, and he was. In reading Howl, in any case, and I heard the recordings of the second readings he did, he talks about the the Jehovic, hyper-rationalistic, judgmental lawgiver, creator of spiritual disorder and political chaos. His abstract calipers limit the infinite universe to his egoic horizon. And how you create a poem that's able to, it's a real journey, and it's a really powerful kind of transmission that's it's visionary, of course, and it's also right at you in a way, and you feel like it's vibratory in the reality that you're in. It actually speaks to in thinking about this, I was thinking about the prophetic quality of particularly Allen and William Burroughs, who we could say a little bit more about, but maybe I'll jump to, this is the Beat book. It's a very good, I had to probe and push on Allen to define beatitude and the Beat generation. He gives about 5 different definitions. It's not particularly narrative, but here's from Mexico City Blues, 211th chorus. The wheel of the quivering meat conception turns in the void, expelling human beings, pigs, turtles, frogs, insects, nits, mice, lice, lizards, rats, roam racing horses, poxy bucolic pig ticks, horrible unnameable lice of vultures, murderous attacking dog armies of Africa, rhinos roaming in the jungle, vast boars and huge gigantic bull elephants, rams, eagles, condors, pones and porcupines and pills, all the endless conception of living beings, gnashing everywhere in consciousness throughout the 10 directions of space, occupying all the quarters in and out from super microcosmic nova to huge galaxy light year owl, illuminating the sky of one mind. Poor, I wish I was free of that slaving meat wheel and safe in heaven dead. So that's Kerouac, of course, Mexico City Blues. And I was in Mexico, working in Mexico City last spring, and there was a documentary being made about all the writing that he did in Mexico. Again, one of the Fellaheen worlds, and below the border and out of America. And then from, there's a wonderful, it goes on different. The next one is Charlie Parker looked like Buddha. And then out of, let's see, Corso poem, Kerouac had said the earth was an Indian thing. Corso has this long poem called The Spontaneous Requiem for the American Indians, so I just want to read a few lines of that. Pilgrim blunderbuss, buckles, high hat, Dutch English, patent leather shoes, Bible, pray, snow, careful, careful. Oh, but feast, turkey, corn, pumpkin, sweet confused, happy hosty guests, Iroquois, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Thanksgiving. Oh joy, oh angels, oh peace, oh land, 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 oh death. Oh, fire and arrow and buckshot and whiskey and rum and death and land of witches and taverns and Quakers and Salem and New Amsterdam and corn and night, soft feet, death, massacre, massacre. Oh, America, oh, requiem, log cabins, forts, outposts, trading posts in the distance, clouds, dust hordes, tribes, death, death, blonde girls to die, gowns of ladies to burn, men of red coats and blue coats to die, boys to drum and fife and curse and cry and die, horses to die, babies to die, yee, ar, yee, ah, to die, to die, to die, to die, America, requiem, corn, jerky, Wortley, the Seneca, and a deacon suit, gawky, awkward, drunk, tired, slash, goes on. But Allen, in this wonderful new book that I recommend, since these lectures were incubated at Naropa University, just down the road at the Jack Kerouac School, Poetics, and we'll maybe talk about that since Andrew and I both taught there many years, but this is the best minds of my generation, the literary history of the beats, and so it's a series of lectures that evolved here, and of course when he arrived he was so excited to think of being able to present a course that was part of a new kind of pedagogy. These things were not being taught in the early 70s, and the way, of course, Allen would teach them. So I recommend that because he actually quotes very much from the text and then gives a wonderful sort of exegesis. Moving along, before we get to the West Coast, I'm going to take, There's Kaddish, of course. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, with your eyes of Russia, with your eyes of no money, with your eyes of false China, with your eyes of Aunt Eleanor, with your eyes of starving India, with your eyes pissing in the park, with your eyes of America taking a fall, with your eyes of the failure at the piano, with your eyes of your relatives in California, with your eyes of Ma Rainey dying in an ambulance, with your eyes of Czechoslovakia attacked by robots, with your eyes going to painting class at night in the Bronx, with your eyes of the killer grandma you see on the horizon from the fire escape, with your eyes running naked out of the apartment screaming into the hall. I'm trying to read these sort of prophetic American poems. Because we have to think about where we are now and why this is all still relevant. Right. That's I go to this work again and again. Mary Baraka, who had a long-time guest at the Kerouac School, but a very a close relationship to Alan and others, of course. But he, there's a period that's considered in his being his beat period, and this is just one of those poems where he's. It's Mojo Hand, Lightnin' Hopkins. From the country to the city, we left where things were pretty to get away from the Klansmen and race freaks who hung with the slave masters, because who could not believe in democracy? Who would not let life be beautiful? Who howled moon shadows screaming for the primitive? Who climbed the trees for past centuries, hollering for caves and blood? From the country to the city, we left where things were pretty, got city life, got city bread, wanted rights and services, get to that, we thought, when all the time it could have been better. When all the time it could have been, it could have been, it could have been better, built could have been, progress could have been, and all the great notes of peace, all the great notes of peace, all that could have been. Diane Prima, this often comes up. What about the women? Where were the women? As I say in this book, which covers that period, the early East Coast period, there really are no women. It's somewhat homoerotic, and it's about a kind of camaraderie, and many women were there, and there's work going on to reclaim some of that work. But Diane DePrima was there, and so was Joanne Kiger on the West Coast. And again, these boundaries, or these categories, are very limited. There's a lot of overlap with the San Francisco Renaissance, with the Black Mountain scene, with the New York School, Frank O'Hara, and so on. So I like to use the overall term of the the experimental new American poetry, which includes these different communities. So this is one of Diane's poems. I met her when I was about 16, 17. She was living in the Albert Hotel on in the East Village of New York, and she had had one child. She dropped out of, I believe it was the Quaker School in and she was sophomore, and she was doing political work, starting a Poets Theater, a small press for the things that poets seem to do. And she had her Buddhist shrine, and she had her chemical tchotchkes, and she was amazing. I thought, okay, I'm not, I was already a feminist, but I thought, here's a great example. Do it all, let's do it. We can be a mother, we can be a Buddhist, we can be a poet, we can do theater, we can get up and rant and rock. Okay, this is a longer poem. I'll just a little bit of it. Rant, again, because I'm trying to pick things that are relevant to our time, still relevant. You cannot write a single line without a cosmology, a cosmogony laid out before all eyes. There is no part of yourself you can separate out, saying this is memory, this is sensation, this is the work I care about, this is how I make a living. It is whole, it is a whole, it always was whole. You do not make it so. There is nothing to integrate. You are a presence, you are an appendage of the work. The work hangs from heaven. You create. Every man, every woman carries a firmament inside, and the stars in it are not the stars in the sky. Without imagination, there is no memory. Without imagination, there is no sensation. Without imagination, there is no will, desire. History is a living weapon in your hand. and you have imagined it is thus that you find out for yourself. The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. The only war that matters is the war against the imagination. The only war that matters is the war against the imagination.
Will, it's partly your peerless reading style, but it's also the heat of those poems and the edge of prophecy and, that sense of, kind of a deep alienation with the world that's around them, and so a real resistance there. And there's a similar resistance, I think, on the West Coast, but I don't think you get that tone of prophecy so much. You get something a lot cooler rather than hot. And I think of the poet Lou Welch talks about how you see the machine and it's bearing down on you, and you're terrified it's going to annihilate you, and then you discover that if you just step a few footsteps to the side, the whole thing rolls past without touching you. And I think that there was, greater coolness to the West Coast poets, particularly with Oriental models available to them. Just for a sort of contrast here, I'll read a poem
the technology of the West Coast, Silicon Valley.
This is a Phil Boylan poem called Further Notice. I can't live in this world, and I refuse to kill myself or let you kill me. The dill plant lives, the airplane, my alarm clock, this ink, I won't go away. I shall be myself, free, a genius, an embarrassment, like the Indian, the buffalo, like Yellowstone National Park. Along with that kind of sort of cool remove, this was named by Kenneth Rexroth as disengagement. He saw the Beat generation as being disengaged, not being not activist or not aware of things, but disengaged from the larger machinery, the sort of what was then called the military-industrial complex, I think is now the sort of military communication entertainment complex, and how you can actually step aside from that and freely live, like as embarrassingly as Yellowstone National Park or the buffalo. This is another poem of Philip Boylan's. He was staked to a trip to Japan by some people who gave him a bit of money to go see where the origins of Zen Buddhism was. And he brings up the names of a couple of cats, pet cats. One is Nansen, who is a famous Zen master, and the other is Fudo, who is a sort of archaic Buddhist deity from Japan. This is called Walking Beside the Kamogawa, remembering Nansen and Fudo and Gary's poem. Gary is his close friend, Gary Snyder. Here are two half-grown black cats perched on a lump of old tea kettle brick plastic garbage 10 feet from the west bank of the river. I won't save them. Right here, Gary sat with dying Nansen, the broken cat, warped and sick every day of its life, puke and drool on the tatami for Gary to wipe up and scold. If you get any worse, I'm gonna have you put away. The vet injected an overdose of Nembi, and for half an hour, Nansen was comfortable. How can we do this? How can we live and die? How does anybody choose for somebody else? How dare we appear in this hellmouth, weeping tears, busting our heads in 10 fragments, making vows and promises? Suzuki Roshi said, if I die, it's all right. If I should live, it's all right. Sun-faced Buddha, moon-faced Buddha. Why do I always fall for that old line? We don't treat each other any better. When will I stop writing it down? Postscript from the Brahmajala Sutra. Always practice liberation of living beings. So it's cool that I think is interesting, and a turn towards Asia and Asiatic models. I also want to mention, a figure who skirts around the edge of the beats in San Francisco, who's Joanne Kiger, who died this last March, I think, good longtime friend of Anne's and myself, and frequent visitor here at Boulder as a guest at the Naropa writing program. She also spent time in Japan and picked up a way of writing that was really dependent on an old Japanese tradition of journal writing, which was to really record daily life and sort of put aside, you know, the kind of mythologies and hallucinations that come through so much Western poetry and look at things that are very discreetly in front of her. This is from a little book of hers called Lo and Behold, Household and Threshold on California's North Coast. And it's about 11 or 12 poems, each of them named for a single year and lifted out of notebooks from that year. 1980. Gull just caught a crab. Gregory Corso. I have not come here to abuse your hospitality. 9 a.m. I want champagne and melons. Melons aren't in season. Down at the store, he buys 3 bottles of champagne and 1 can of sliced pineapple. I'm going crazy. Gin John next to the living proof speakers. A group of women buy the bookstore downtown, which is stocked with small press poetry books. One of the new owners dumps them all into the dumpster. Her husband is a poet. Saw a 4-foot snake at the beach in the dunes, green with reddish-brown spots. Maybe a rattler, says Don. Rests its head in the shade under the bag from Chiapas. After being prodded, shoots with astonishing swiftness across the blanket and into the dune. Grass and succulent camouflage, gopher snake. We start a hot tub club, but are unable to locate a hot tub. Christmas in paradise, oratories and readings, a little match girl, selections from the Bible and the I Ching, gift bumper stickers reading, I, Blake for animals.
My favorite, one of my favorite books that Joanne's is her Japan and India journals, and sometimes called Big Move. It's come out at several different publishers, and there's a new edition. But she's traveling with Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky, and Gary Snyder, who was her husband. And she, at one point, well, they're in India at that point, and Peter, Peter's letting his hair grow long, it's getting long and greasy, the better to take drugs behind. Allen Ginsberg keeps wanting to read Howl to anybody who will listen, including the Dalai Lama. The doll, she calls him the doll. And then she's just standing around, and Gary's criticizing her shoes. She's not wearing the proper shoes, you know, to hike to all these special sites. And so at one point she says, I'm just standing around in my drip dry black dress waiting for some wild martini attention. So she was clearly with the wrong, you know, travelers. Not exactly. It's very, it's wonderful to have that account, to have this, I don't want to say just woman's voice, she's much, you know, it's more complicated than that, but she was a great sense of humor, let's put it that way.
And really a wry sense of humor, and you know, kind of dry and very witty the way Mark Twain is. Yeah. But that is an important book because she really, you know, it is about a woman too, because she's really a woman struggling in a world of these men who are getting famous around her and trying to figure out how to write, and I think it was sort of a brilliant thing that she found this old journal tradition of India and I mean, not India, Japan, and you know, used it as a way of getting at a kind of daily notation of events directly in front of herself, and made a poetics out of it that I think is still, you know, really quite remarkable one, full of great humor, of course, but also close observation, the kind of observation, say, William Blake called for but didn't actually have.
In particular is look to the little ones. But she was also not showing them her writing, and they were modest about it. And it was actually years later, Allen was finally acknowledging her in the recent years at Naropa, and Gary, in fact, did a lecture on her work at the New York Public Library a couple of years ago with Whale. And finally, you know, now they could see it somehow. They were blinded by their gender or something.
So one of the things that's really quite important about the Beat generation is, I think, the new territory they claimed for literature.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's Joanne and then also Alan and Gary turned the journal from a kind of, private musing place.
We had Basho.
Yeah, they had Basho, they had Izumi Shikubu and various people, but that, and then, the claiming the territory of subject matter, which they got a little bit from Ezra Pound, but of course the famous trial for obscenity around Howell in San Francisco, which was followed up by a much less publicized trial, but just as important, with a woman named Lenore Candell, who wrote a little chapbook called The Love Book that was very explicit, loving sexual poetry, and that also, spent a long time in San Francisco Civic Court, and the fact that Howell beat the charges of obscenity because people demonstrated that it was real literature, and then Lenore Candell's book also opened up all sorts of opportunities, the words we use, the subject matter we can write about. And that might be a good place to ask about a little bit about the legacy, because I feel that very directly ecological awareness, what we now talk about is diversity and inclusivity, the awareness of the perils of nuclear power, the sort of collusion of military and corporate interests are all things that the Beats really brought to our attention, while maybe, not to put down people like Robert Lowell, but while he was lying on his mother's bed, wiped out in Milltown, these other guys were doing incredible investigations of the CIA drug trafficking or the development of
Michael McClure's work and his great poem that he read at the famous Sixth Gallery, the Whales.
The whales, yeah. So seems sort of ahead of the curve, the ecological disasters that we now recognize everywhere around us in the extinction of species.
And for me, William Burroughs really has had a kind of beat on our times. I mean, the surveillance state that we're in,
the addiction.
The addiction major, just really exploring what that is, the addiction in all the layers of our society and world, the euphemisms that are used in our, just examining language, the sense that the word can be this killer virus, to sort of undo that, and being so attuned to his dreams, to a kind of, I don't know what to call him, he's put himself through different sensory deprivation projects to get to a more Bosch-like reality, stream realities. His books are very difficult for some people. I think there's...
Yeah, and that idea of the words being killer viruses, they may not be viruses exactly, but all you have to do is listen to the institutions speak of any of our institutions at this point. You realize how deadly the language is and how full it is really of outright, lies, deceptions, deviations, and that sort of thing. But I also think, that you could trace a lot of ecological awareness to the Beats, Michael McClure and Gary Snyder and Joanne Kiger.
There were people here at Europa, Alan very much spearheading the work with the Rocky Flats Truth Course. I'm sure there are people in this room who've been very involved with Rocky Flats, which continues to be many issues around how that land, which is still polluted, is being used and so on. The idea of a theme park where you can walk your animals and take your children and so on. His wonderful Plutonian Ode, which he composed here in Boulder in the 70s. It really deconstructs the whole nuclear kind of nightmare and investigates. We call it documentary poetics, and that's a term that's used more frequently now. That this investigative documentary poetics, where you actually research and go into the element of plutonium, say, or the history of nuclear disaster in this country. So we were arrested at Rocky Flats, I guess, in the 70s. Maybe there are people in this room who were part of those actions. And Daniel Ellsberg came in on that. So Alan, into his final years, was incredibly active with that, with many other causes.
And then it was out of that you and Alan founded the Kerouac School at Nairobi University.
So that was in 1974, at the invitation of the Buddhist meditation teacher who lured people out here for a summer program. It was just going to be a summer program. And then we had a board meeting. John Cage was in town and others, the poet, Jackson McClough, and Diane was here, and Alan himself, and we were at sort of the end of the sessions, maybe 3 weeks, and all kinds of people coming through, various Zen teachers and other artists. I think Timothy Leary breezed through town, probably Abby Hoffman, all kinds of subversive folk checking out Boulder. So at this meeting, at one point, Jürgen Rinpoche, the meditation teacher, said something like, well, it's a 100-year project at least. And that was actually, I really felt the, transmission, the Shaktipat of a 100-year project. Nobody was talking about in that way, in those terms, within the artist communities. And I've been working at the St. Mark's Poetry Project in New York City, which is a very much grassroots. Alan called it his poetry church. It was very free writing workshops. And we were also sharing space with the Black Panthers at one point with a breakfast kitchen and a group called the Motherfuckers and a group of Trotskyites. That was interesting. Trotskyites, and we were sharing it with the church itself. So you had a vestry of Episcopal church goers, wonderful. I sat in the vestry for a while when I was director of the project, and we were all working together, using the space in very creative and very activist ways. So to come to Boulder, but we were thinking, the one-year plan, do we have enough money to get through the year? Do we have enough money for the next breakfast, for the breakfast program, and so on? And we were doing things like benefits for Biafra, very, very immediate and very rising to every occasion we could. But the funding was always sketchy, and it had been started with a grant from Lyndon Johnson's Office of Economic Opportunity, which was interesting, for 2 years, to help alienated youth on the Lower East Side. So I came out to Boulder, and here was this 100-year project in this extraordinary environment with all the negative ions and rocky flats down the road, and the East meets West, being so close to the Continental Divide, and thinking about the idea of these different these coasts, this bi-coastal extraordinary poetry activity going on, and the way that people were connecting. Often people would send each other their little tape cassettes of a reading, interesting, and the newest work, often work not published yet, so much small press activity going on, so that already this network, and so this fantasy of then getting East and West Coast here to Boulder became very much our idea. And of course, Alan wanted to bring his worlds, and I was this generation under, and I wanted to help it bring my world, not my worlds, I own them, but this sense of a continuity of this experimental activist Dharma lineage. So this 100-year project, and Alan felt it too. And that night, we were up all night. We were staying at some of these student housing, and we just started making lists of all the people we'd invite, the chairs. We'd have a chair for Palestine with an Israeli poet. We were just trying to be, it was something that the UN should be doing. We were thinking big. So the 100-year project, we're in year, 45, 44? I just want to make it to the... Actually, Chuck Levi, our president, is calling it the 500-year project. But the point being to think, I think that's, and I often ask people, what is your 100-year project? I ask younger people this in a time which looks so fraught and dangerous, and with the end time in mind, yes.
Let's open it up to the audience. Yeah, people want to ask questions or respond to a few of the things we've said. The Beat generation is like an enormous,
so huge
realm of interesting figures, great figures, scoundrels, questionable people, many, many books. Outlaws, but it does seem to be something that constantly inspires interest in something. If you judiciously go through the books, you'll find really important messages for today. So anyhow, questions?
I just want to say, we used to have an ad, come study with people who've been, put in jail for their beliefs. It's not something we see for most creative writing programs.
Oh, we have a question here. I'm a great fan of On the Road, but there was an equally important American writer, Truman Capote, who commented on Jack Kerouac's On the Road, saying, "This is not writing, this is typing." Your comments?
Well, sure. It's not everybody's taste, you know. Kerouac didn't make himself necessarily a lot of friends once he became famous. He withdrew quite a bit into himself. I think there are, other cogent, criticisms. There's all sorts of stories. Kenneth Rexroth having a salon in San Francisco, and Kerouac coming in and plopping himself down on the floor cross-legged and announcing, "I'm a Zen Buddhist," and then slowly discovering that everybody in the room speaks at least 2 Asian languages. But this is part of the lore, and in a funny way, we need multiple writers and we need multiple traditions, not just a single one. So Kerouac's a terrific writer, and Truman Capote has his role too, and we need them all.
But I think you start to, you study the work and understand what, really taking it apart and looking I often think of what I call a subvocal, or it's referred to as a subvocal in Kerouac. You're constantly feeling his ear as you read his writing, and the mood, one thing instanter on the next, and also the sense of insight, sudden insight that, and it expands to the, the cosmic, where some very small thing is happening down here below, and he's looking at the stars. So that kind of play between the micro and the macrocosm, and all the layers of the editing, this idea that it was all spontaneous, and he was just typing, and it was the first draft. I mean, if you look at the early version, the original of the teletype, but also there was a version, parts of On the Road were written in French, in his original language, his family's original language. So there's if one is interested, there's so much more texture. Sorry.
Hi, I am a PhD student at Boulder in English and work on post-war women writers. And I was wondering if you could speak to the recovery work that's being done on the women beat poets that you mentioned, or writers and poets.
Well, there's several book anthologies now, and different, I've forgotten who I've heard from, like Jenny Skirl has also worked a lot with Burroughs' work. There's something called I believe it's something like Black Stockings, Net Stocking, something about the women of the beat. It's a silly title. But it's an interesting anthology. There was an early book from Canary Press that I wrote a foreword for that covered Elise Cowan, for example, a woman who died of suicide at the age of 22, who was very close to Allen Ginsberg, quite in love with him, and had hoped to go, travel with him. And I don't want to sort of project the trauma there, but do you know some of that?
Yeah,
Who are you? What women are you studying?
So I was actually really interested in women who aren't really like Eve Harper and Joan Silver, and sorry. So women
who are not known at all.
Yeah. So some of the memoirists, but then Joan.
Well, yeah, that was another an idea that the genre for the women was really memoir, as in Joyce Johnson's Minor Characters, and that's such an important book. And of course, that was widely read. And I'm not sure who's working on some of the women you've mentioned, but you should do it. Yeah. I'd love to talk later.
Hi, my question is for Anne. And could you please tell us about your method? Because Kerouac had spontaneous prose, and Ginsberg had this breath unit meter. You have come up with the project of fast-speaking women in a way. So could you please comment on your style of speaking and the new genre that you have introduced? I think I see it as a trajectory of that empowering beat voice that was prevalent in the 50s and now too.
Well, I think that early incantory, chant poem, and that there are other examples, is a from the I guess 70s, early 70s, something like that, and been much more involved with the documentary investigative side, which includes all kinds of genres. You know, one uses the word hybrid these days, but long texts and longer poems that yes, of course, there's Howe being a kind of epic poem, and Kaddish as well, and I consider Burroughs' work very much like poetry, and the way it's constructed through montage and time travel and so on. So some of those things I feel like I've kept going in a way, working with Dream, working with Cut Up to some extent, working sometimes with other languages or binary texts. So I'd say that's what I'm more engaged with in the last decade or so. But I don't know where you place yourself in terms of the forms that you work with, but I do trust a sense of a longer kind of narrative. It has to do with the time, that we're in. I felt I needed to write an epic, which was the Eovis project, which turned into a 1,000-page work, and that took about 20 years, and it was trying to include everything and tell the story of my time, my tribe, and leave something for the younger generation, and investigate all these histories and not just my own. So it's not a personal account, but kind of layered. So layering, but this is all something that writers are doing, I think, in many, and feeling also this, part of a wave of women, coming of age in the 70s and 80s, and born in the, around the world, end of the World War II, and also being in a kind of working in community, working in public space, working in these political factors to change the world. But poetry. Well, I was going to read a quote from this interesting writer. But he talks about how the times we're in, people in the future will see that it was the poets who doggedly took out of the falling city, took the idols, the treasures, the gems, what we need to keep true in our sense of civilization and humanity, and took those into hiding and went to the forest and kept. So there's that kind of push, and I think some of the vision and the studies, of course, that Andrew has done, his translations from Sanskrit and the Naropa project are on these same kinds of trajectories and encourage exploratory poetics. So,
you just mentioned about the documentary poetics. What are the subjects that are covered under that poetry? Can you shed some light?
Well, for me, I have a book called Manatee, Humanity, and so I investigated the endangered species. Jeb Bush had taken the manatee off the endangered species list in Florida. This was some years ago, and I was working in Florida, and alarm about it. It relates to climate change and also how we work with our mammal cousins and investigating that life form, ancient life form. Goes way back. And
yeah, I think one of the impulses for documentary poetics is the sense that there can be other methods than traditional journalism to, discuss historical events or political events or things that are happening. So there have been people who've written poems on everything from, strip mining of coal in the United States and in China to CIA involvement in drug dealing or assassinations, or collusion between governments for massacres. I mean, there's all sorts of news that doesn't come out in the mainstream media, or it comes out in a way where it gets really denatured, or it becomes sort of, that's what you read about today, and it's gone. And there's a little bit of a sense that if you can actually cast it into a poetic form or into a literary form that's got some durability, it then becomes much more of a literary monument to truth rather than, the kind of throwaway quality of most journalism. So there have been many poets, even who don't speak of documentary poetics, who work on it, or poets like Allen Ginsberg, who kept files, huge files on corruption and political figures, and it didn't necessarily go into his poetry, but he was tracking it all the time.
They were keeping files on him. Them.
And he was always trying to cut deals with J. Edgar Hoover, who he was investigating.
But I think that it has a potential to become a whole branch of poetry, And
yeah, I don't want to, institutionalize it particularly, but it's true. It is a form that is very open within itself, but it comes out of the epic, the sense of the epic, and then traditionally the epic has a certain.
Thank you very much.
Job to do.
And so I think we've got time for one more.
Yes, Anne, I liked when we did our dialogues on KGU that in a sense you extended this notion of documentary poetics to any one of us. We are all artists and poets in the sense that when we liberate our minds from the colonizing culture and we're able to speak authentic truth, we are engaging in documentary poetics, and I love your reframing of the notion of outsider as outrider. And I'd like you to talk about that, because we are all outriders when we are in that energy of the truth elements.
Outrider? It's a term for sheep herding. Right? Sheep herding.
Literally.
Yeah, but you have to stay ahead of the curve and always be changing the name because it gets appropriated really quickly.
Don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone we're using outrider.
The Outrider app for your telephone.
But the point is that you're not going away from, you're not negating anything. You're riding alongside. The outsider sort of rejects, and there is this impulse. I mean, I want to, I'm feeling like an assassin lately, or I want to get out of the country, or I want to do something. And, but outrider has to straight in the saddle, steady on, keep and being informed and knowing what everybody's doing in a way.
Bob Dylan said, to live outside the law, you must be honest. Absolutely sweet and read. Allen Ginsberg told me that was Bob Dylan told him that was his favorite line in all of his music.
He stole it.
Well, let's thank Anne Waldman and Andrew Schelling for a wonderful session.